You won't want to miss this. Before we jump in, hit subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. Jack Morrison stood at the edge of a cliff that seemed to stretch forever, its crystalline surface reflecting a vast, alien city sprawled beneath him. The sky above was alive with movement, nebulae swirling like paint on an artist's palette, stars flaring with unnatural rhythm, their light bending in impossible arcs. It wasn't the gentle twinkle of Earth's familiar constellations but a chaotic symphony that thrummed with energy. He could feel it in his bones, a pulse aligning with his heartbeat, drawing him closer to the edge. The city below was a kaleidoscope of colors and movement, its towering spires of living crystal shifting and reshaping as though they were breathing. Great ships floated between them, their hulls glowing with bioluminescent veins. The streets pulsed with life, beings of every conceivable form moving like rivers through the arteries of the city. Some hovered, others glided, and a few moved in ways Jack's mind couldn't fully process. A breeze, warm and electric, swept past him, carrying whispers in languages he didn't recognize. The words brushed his ears like ghostly touches, leaving behind a mix of unease and exhilaration. He tightened his grip on the object in his hands, a crown, heavy and jagged, its crystalline facets glowing faintly. Its surface was warm, humming softly, as if it were alive. Ambassador Morrison. A voice called from behind, clear and musical, yet tinged with urgency. Jack turned, his heart racing. A figure emerged from the swirling shadows, Princess Zalara. She was breathtaking, her blue-scaled form radiating a soft, otherworldly light. Her pointed ears twitched slightly, a trait considered primitive by her people, but to Jack, it made her seem real. Her natural eyes, large and expressive, were fixed on him, filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Jack, you need to leave," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not safe here." He frowned, glancing back at the city. "What's happening?" As if in response, the ground beneath him trembled. The city screamed, an eerie, mechanical wail that rose in pitch until it was almost unbearable. Towers began to collapse inward, shattering into a cascade of shards that glittered like falling stars. The sky darkened, the swirling nebulae dissolving into void. Ships in the distance burst into flames, their wreckage plummeting into the chaos below. "Zalara!" Jack shouted as the cliff cracked beneath his feet. He stumbled, the crown slipping from his hands and tumbling toward the abyss. Instinctively, he reached for it, but Zalara grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Forget the crown," she yelled, pulling him back. Her scaled hand was cold against his skin, yet her touch grounded him. "You can't save them." "What's happening?" he demanded again, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "The council," she hesitated, her scales flickering with subtle colors Jack couldn't interpret. "They've gone too far. The perfection they sought. It's unraveling everything. You have to stop them." Before he could ask how, the ground beneath them gave way entirely. Jack felt the sickening lurch of freefall as the cliff crumbled into the abyss. He reached out, grasping for anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. Zalara's voice echoed in his ears, desperate and fading. "Jack, don't let them." The darkness swallowed everything. Jack jolted awake, gasping for air. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he couldn't tell where he was. The dream clung to him like a second skin, too vivid to dismiss. Slowly, the sterile white walls of his quarters aboard the stellar Voyager came into focus. The soft hum of the ship's systems replaced the screams of the collapsing city. He sat up, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. The crown, the city, Zalara, they had felt so real. He could still feel the phantom weight of the crown in his hands, the warmth of Zalara's grip. The communicator at his bedside chimed, pulling him further from the dream. "Ambassador," came the crisp voice of his aide, Lieutenant Greaves. "We're approaching the Grand Council chamber. The convergence begins in 15 minutes. Jack exhaled, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "Understood. I'll be there shortly." As the line went dead, Jack lingered, staring at the floor. Dreams weren't supposed to leave impressions this deep. He could still hear Zalara's voice, pleading with him to leave, to stop something. And the city, how could a place his mind had never seen feel so familiar? Shaking his head, he stood and moved to the small wash station. The mirror reflected a man in his late 30s, his face marked by years of diplomatic negotiations and long spacefaring journeys. His hazel eyes, though sharp, held the weight of sleepless nights, and his hair was starting to show flecks of gray. "Get it together, Morrison," he muttered to himself, splashing cold water on his face. By the time he dressed in his formal ambassadorial uniform, a dark suit adorned with subtle insignias representing Earth, he had managed to push the dream to the back of his mind. The stellar Voyager docked seamlessly at the Grand Council Station, a massive orbital structure that served as the political heart of the galaxy. Jack stepped onto the docking platform, greeted by Lieutenant Greaves and a small entourage of aides. "Sir," Greaves said, falling into step beside him as they made their way to the council chamber. "There's been some chatter about today's convergence. Something unusual might be announced." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Unusual how?" Greaves hesitated, his expression guarded. "Rumors, mostly. Something about the Crystalline Empire." Jack's stomach tightened, though he couldn't say why. "Anything specific?" "No, sir. But considering their influence, any shakeup could have galaxy-wide implications." The Crystalline Empire controlled nearly half of the galaxy's energy production, their advanced technology making them one of the most powerful factions in the Council. Any political instability within their ranks would send ripples through every star system. As they entered the sprawling chamber, Jack took a moment to absorb the grandeur. The dome stretched high above, its crystalline walls refracting light into dazzling patterns that danced across the room. Delegates from countless species filled the tiered seats, their forms as varied as the stars themselves. Luminescent beings floated alongside towering mechanoids, and organic species with genetically perfected features mingled with crystalline entities that shimmered like living sculptures. Jack couldn't help but feel out of place. Among this assembly of engineered perfection, his unmodified human form was a glaring anomaly. "Ambassador Morrison," a familiar voice purred. Jack turned to see Counselor Lysandra approaching, her silver skin rippling with subtle patterns of superiority. Her movements were impossibly graceful, each step calculated to draw attention. "Still embracing your species' natural state, I see," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Jack offered her a disarming smile. "Some of us prefer vintage models, Counselor. They have more character." "Character," she repeated, as if the word were a foreign concept. "Is that what your species calls its refusal to evolve?" Before Jack could respond, the chamber's crystalline walls pulsed with deep purple light, the universal signal for silence. The Grand Arbiter materialized on the central podium, his symmetrical features set in an expression of grave importance. "Esteemed members of the Galactic Council," he began, his voice resonating at the exact frequency for maximum attention. "We gather today to address an unprecedented situation." A hologram shimmered into existence, revealing the late King Zarx of the Crystalline Empire. Jack recognized him immediately, his crystalline form radiating authority even in death. "To the Galactic Council," Zarx's recorded voice began, "I leave you a puzzle. To Ambassador Jack Morrison of Earth, I leave my greatest treasure, my daughter, Princess Zalara, as his bride." The room erupted into chaos. Jack froze, the weight of the dream crashing over him like a tidal wave. It hadn't been just a dream. The Grand Council chamber pulsed with an electric energy that bordered on the supernatural. The dome's crystalline walls reflected refracted light, casting the assembly in a shimmering haze of multicolored brilliance. The air was thick with expectation, a heavy silence punctuated only by the subtle hum of levitating platforms and the occasional rustle of movement from the audience. Jack Morrison stood on the chamber floor, feeling as though the weight of the galaxy pressed against his shoulders. Around him, the galaxy's most influential beings had gathered, each a perfect representation of their species. Luminescent figures with geometrically flawless bodies floated on anti-gravity fields. Crystalline nobles with symmetrical, facete forms glimmered like living gemstones. Organic species with genetically optimized proportions and radiant, unblemished skin displayed their engineered superiority. Jack, by contrast, felt like a relic, a natural human among beings who embodied the galaxy's obsession with perfection. The Grand Arbiter's holographic presence commanded the chamber's attention. His symmetrical features and perfectly modulated voice were unnervingly precise, designed to evoke trust and authority. Esteemed members of the Galactic Council, he began, his words reverberating across the hall. We gather today to address a matter of unparalleled significance. The Crystalline Empire, a cornerstone of our civilization, faces a moment of profound transition. King Zarx, their leader and visionary, has passed beyond the veil of existence. A collective murmur swept through the chamber, like the distant rumble of thunder. The Crystalline Empire's influence was vast, its energy production and technological innovations serving as the backbone of countless star systems. The death of their king was not merely a political event, it was a galactic earthquake. Jack's diplomatic instincts kicked in, analyzing the room's reactions. The crystalline delegates displayed their emotions subtly, their facets dimming or brightening in measured patterns. Organic species whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from concern to intrigue. Even the luminous beings, whose glowing forms usually radiated calm detachment, seemed unsettled. The Arbiter raised a hand, silencing the murmurs with a single, calculated gesture. The King's will contains provisions that are unprecedented. A hologram materialized in the center of the chamber, revealing King Zarx himself. The late monarch's crystalline form was regal and commanding, his facets gleaming with an inner light that seemed to defy his absence from the mortal plane. Jack remembered meeting Zarx once, during a diplomatic summit on the Outer Rim. The King's sharp wit and unexpected humor had left an impression on him. The holographic Zarx began to speak, his voice resonant and warm, a stark contrast to the cold formality of the council chamber. To the Galactic Council, I leave you a challenge. Our galaxy has pursued perfection for centuries, yet in doing so, we have lost sight of what makes us truly extraordinary. Our individuality, our imperfections, our diversity of thought and form. A ripple of unease passed through the chamber. Zarx's words were heretical in a society that had long equated perfection with progress. To Ambassador Jack Morrison of Earth, the hologram continued, I leave my greatest treasure, my daughter, Princess Zalara, as his bride. The chamber erupted into chaos. Delegates shouted over one another, their perfect composure shattered by the shock of the announcement. Crystalline nobles dimmed their facets in outrage, while organic representatives exchanged incredulous looks. Even the luminous beings flickered, their light fluctuating with uncharacteristic intensity. Jack stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the words. Marriage? To Princess Zalara? The idea was absurd. Yet, as the room swirled with noise and disbelief, a second hologram appeared, this one of Zalara herself. She was different. Unlike her peers, whose crystalline forms were smooth and symmetrical, Zalara's appearance defied the engineered ideals of her people. Her blue scales were irregular, forming patterns that caught the light in unpredictable ways. Her pointed ears, considered primitive by modern standards, gave her an air of otherworldly grace. But it was her eyes that struck Jack the most. They were large, expressive, and completely natural, free of the enhancements that most in the galaxy viewed as essential. How unfortunate, someone whispered nearby, their tone dripping with disdain. Jack's gaze remained fixed on the hologram. Zalara's eyes held a depth he rarely saw in the genetically optimized. There was intelligence in them, but also something else, a carefully concealed pain, the kind that spoke of years spent as an outsider in her own society. Before he could think, a crystalline noble, Counselor Vose, stepped forward, his facets glowing with feigned sympathy. Ambassador Morrison, he said, his voice smooth but sharp, given the unique circumstances, the Council would understand if you wish to decline this inheritance. It would be cruel to burden you with such a challenging union. Jack's hands clenched at his sides. He felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the whispers of judgment that filled the air. But more than that, He felt the weight of Zalara's holographic presence, the unspoken plea in her natural eyes. "I request to meet the princess," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent. Even the arbiter seemed momentarily taken aback. "Ambassador Morrison," he began, his tone measured, "surely you do not intend to entertain this arrangement. Consider the implications, the diplomatic fallout, the political consequences." "It would be disrespectful," Jack interrupted, "to make such a decision without meeting my potential wife in person. Unless, of course, the council wishes to deny me this basic courtesy." The chamber doors parted with a crystalline chime, and for the first time, Princess Zalara stepped into the room. The room's light shifted as she entered, her blue-scaled form casting prismatic patterns across the chamber walls. She moved with a natural grace that stood in stark contrast to the calculated elegance of the other crystalline nobles. The murmurs returned, louder this time, as delegates struggled to contain their reactions. "Ambassador Morrison," Zalara said, her voice carrying musical undertones that no genetic optimization could replicate. She inclined her head slightly in a gesture of respect, though her expression remained guarded. "I apologize if my father's decision has put you in an uncomfortable position." Jack stepped forward, studying her closely. Up close, her scales were even more striking, their irregular patterns creating a beauty that was as unique as it was unconventional. Her eyes, too, were even more vivid, shifting colors subtly with her emotions. "Your Highness," Jack replied, his voice steady, "the only uncomfortable position would be failing to properly consider such an honor." His words caused a ripple of surprise to pass through the chamber. Even Zalara's expression shifted slightly, her scales catching the light in a way that suggested amusement, or perhaps disbelief. "You are either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily foolish, Ambassador," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Jack smiled. "Perhaps a bit of both." Before either could say more, Councillor Vaux stepped forward again, his tone dripping with condescension. "Ambassador Morrison, this charade has gone on long enough. Think of your career. Think of the diplomatic implications." Jack turned to him, his voice firm. "Councillor, I believe the late king's will is clear. Unless the council intends to defy the wishes of one of its most influential leaders, I see no reason to refuse this proposal." Vaux's crystalline form dimmed in frustration, but he said nothing more. Zalara stepped closer to Jack, her scaled hand extended in the formal greeting of her people. "Ambassador Morrison," she said, her voice soft but steady, "if you truly wish to proceed, then I will honor my father's wishes." Jack reached out, taking her hand in his. Her scales were cool against his skin, but the touch was grounding, solid. "Your Highness," he said, "I look forward to what comes next." As the murmurs of the council rose again, Jack and Zalara stood side by side, their union already a symbol of defiance in a galaxy obsessed with conformity. The private receiving chamber adjoining the Grand Council Hall was a study in contrasts. Its gleaming crystalline walls and meticulously symmetrical furniture were an ode to the galaxy's obsession with perfection. Yet, within this pristine environment, tension crackled like a live wire. Jack Morrison stood near a crystalline column, its surface refracting light into delicate rainbows. Across from him, Princess Zalara held herself with the poise of someone accustomed to scrutiny but weary of it. Jack watched her closely. Up close, her natural beauty was even more striking. Her irregular blue scales shimmered with an organic complexity that no engineered perfection could replicate. Her large, unmodified eyes betrayed a wariness that spoke volumes. She was used to being judged, used to being underestimated, and it irritated Jack to see how the galaxy had branded her an outcast for daring to be different. "Ambassador Morrison," Zalara began, her voice calm but edged with bitterness, "I believe we should be frank with one another. My father's unconventional proposal has clearly put you in a difficult position." Jack folded his arms, leaning casually against the column. "Your Highness, I think your father was trying to send a message. The question is, do you agree with him?" Zalara's pointed ears twitched, a slight but telling reaction. "That depends on what you think the message is, Ambassador." Jack shrugged, a faint smile playing at his lips. That perfection isn't all it's cracked up to be. That individuality, imperfection, is worth protecting. Zalara's scales shifted subtly, catching the light in a pattern Jack couldn't quite interpret. An interesting interpretation. But you've only known me for a few minutes. How can you be so certain? Because I've seen enough of this galaxy to know what it values, and what it's losing, Jack replied, his tone steady. He stepped closer, meeting her gaze. Your father must have seen it too. Otherwise, he wouldn't have risked everything on a proposal like this. Zalara tilted her head, studying him. And yet, you could have refused. You still can. Jack considered her words. The truth was, part of him had wanted to walk away. The political ramifications of accepting this union were staggering. Earth was already viewed as a primitive backwater by the Galactic Council. Tying himself to a princess deemed an outcast by her own people would make him a pariah in diplomatic circles. But something about Zalara's presence, the defiance in her stance, the intelligence in her gaze, compelled him to stay. Your Highness, he said finally, I've learned that the best decisions in life are often the ones everyone else tells you not to make. Before Zalara could respond, the chamber doors opened with a sharp crystalline chime. The Grand Arbiter entered, his silver skin shimmering with barely concealed agitation. His symmetrical features were perfectly composed, but his eyes betrayed his frustration. Ambassador Morrison, the Arbiter said, his tone clipped, the Council has convened a private session to address the implications of this situation. Your presence is required immediately. Jack straightened, but before he could reply, Zalara stepped forward, her expression unyielding. Grand Arbiter, questioning my fathers will violate several Council protocols regarding sovereign rights. As the rightful heir to the Crystalline Empire, I demand that these protocols be respected. The Arbiter's perfect features twitched, the closest thing to a scowl Jack had seen from him. Your Highness, he said coldly, this arrangement is unprecedented. It threatens to destabilize. What it threatens, Jack interrupted, stepping between the Arbiter and Zalara, is the status quo. And maybe that's exactly what this galaxy needs. The Arbiter turned to Jack, his expression hardening. Ambassador, you would do well to consider the long-term consequences of your actions. This marriage is not in your best interest, or the interests of your people. Jack met the Arbiter's gaze without flinching. Respectfully, Grand Arbiter, I'll decide what's in my best interest. And right now, I believe honoring King Xarx's will is the right thing to do. The Arbiter's silver skin darkened slightly, a subtle but telling sign of anger. Very well, he said tightly. But do not mistake the Council's tolerance for approval. You are making powerful enemies, Ambassador. Jack smirked, the hint of a challenge in his eyes. Better than making boring friends. The Arbiter swept from the room, his perfect posture rigid with displeasure. The doors closed behind him, leaving Jack and Zalara alone once more. Zalara's scales flickered with what Jack guessed was amusement. That was either very brave or very foolish. Why not both? Jack replied, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Zalara shook her head, a faint smile breaking through her composed exterior. You realize this won't be easy. The Council will do everything in their power to stop this union. I wouldn't expect anything less, Jack said. He hesitated, then added, but I have a feeling your father knew exactly what he was doing. Care to enlighten me? Zalara's expression grew serious, her scales shifting to a darker hue. My father believed our society's obsession with perfection was leading us down a dangerous path. He saw what the optimization programs were doing to our people, how they stripped away individuality, creativity, even joy. He wanted to remind the galaxy of what we were losing. Jack nodded, his suspicions confirmed. And he thought I might understand that. Perhaps, Zalara said, though her voice held a note of skepticism. Or perhaps he simply enjoyed defying expectations. Jack chuckled. I can respect that. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Jack watched as Zalara's gaze drifted to the chamber's window, where the shimmering skyline of the diplomatic quarter was visible. Her expression softened, her scales shifting to a more subdued hue. "What about you?" Jack asked quietly. Zalara turned back to him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What about me? Why did you refuse optimization?" Jack said. "You must have had your reasons." Zalara hesitated, her scales flickering with faint patterns. "Because I saw what it did to others. I saw how they became hollow. Their perfection came at the cost of everything that made them unique." She looked down, her voice growing softer. "And because I didn't want to lose myself." Jack felt a surge of admiration for her courage. "I think your father would be proud of you." Zalara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps. But that doesn't mean this will end well." Jack stepped closer, his tone gentle but firm. "Sometimes the best things in life don't start easy, but they're worth fighting for." Zalara studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I suppose we'll find out." As the chamber doors opened once more, a crystalline attendant entered, announcing that the council was awaiting their formal decision. Jack and Zalara exchanged a glance, the weight of the moment settling between them. "Ready to make history?" Jack asked, offering her his arm. Zalara hesitated, then placed her hand on his arm, her touch cool and steady. "Lead the way, Ambassador. Let's give them something to talk about." Together, they walked toward the council chamber, their footsteps echoing in the pristine halls. Around them, the whispers of judgment and disapproval began anew, but Jack barely noticed. His focus was on the path ahead, and the woman beside him. The council chamber erupted into chaos as Jack and Zalara entered, side by side. Delegates shouted, their voices a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. But Jack held his head high, his resolve unshaken. "Grand Arbiter," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, "I formally accept King Xarx's bequest and the offer of marriage to Princess Zalara of the Crystalline Empire." The room fell silent, the weight of Jack's words settling over the assembly like a thunderclap. The Arbiter's perfect features twisted in shock, but Jack paid him no mind. Instead, he turned to Zalara, who met his gaze with a mixture of surprise and determination. In that moment, as the galaxy's most powerful beings looked on, Jack knew there was no turning back. The stellar lotus hung suspended in the diplomatic quarter's glowing skyline, a relic of simpler times amidst a sea of perfection. The restaurant's traditional design, a blend of natural curves and organic materials, contrasted starkly with the engineered symmetry dominating the rest of the Crystalline Empire's architecture. Its warm, inviting glow drew Jack Morrison and Princess Zalara toward it like moths to a flame. Inside, the atmosphere was intimate and disarmingly natural. Flames flickered in containment fields along the walls, their soft light casting shadows that danced unpredictably. The subtle imperfection was an intentional design, a nod to the artistry of chaos. Zalara walked ahead of Jack, her blue-scaled form drawing every eye in the room. Her presence wasn't just striking, it was polarizing. Conversations dropped to whispers as patrons registered her identity, their gazes a mix of curiosity, disdain, and disbelief. Jack, however, remained unbothered. If anything, he leaned into the attention, stepping closer to Zalara with an easy confidence that dared the room to judge him. "Princess," he said, gesturing toward a corner table by the window. "Shall we?" Zalara hesitated, her gaze sweeping the room. Jack noticed the slight ripple in her scales, the telltale sign of discomfort she couldn't entirely hide. "You're not used to being seen like this, are you?" Jack asked softly. She turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Being seen isn't the problem. It's what they think they see." Jack offered a small, reassuring smile. "Let's show them something they're not expecting." Zalara tilted her head, studying him for a moment before nodding. Together, they crossed the room and took their seats. A server drone approached, its polished surface reflecting the warm light of the flames. "Honored patrons," it began, its voice smooth but mechanical. "Might I suggest today's optimized protein selection? It has been engineered for." "We'll take the natural menu," Jack interrupted. "And a bottle of earth wine. Vintage, if you have it." The drone paused, its processors clearly struggling to reconcile the request. Sir, our scans indicate the lady is of crystalline nobility. Surely. The lady, Zalara cut in, her voice cool and commanding, would like to taste real food for a change. Is that going to be a problem? The drone hesitated for a fraction of a second before its servo's word in compliance. No problem at all, Your Highness. It glided away, leaving Jack grinning. Impressive, he said, raising an eyebrow. Zalara's scales flickered with a faint, amused glow. A lifetime of dealing with drones and sycophants has its uses. Jack chuckled. I'll have to remember that. The wine arrived first, a deep red liquid poured into glasses that caught the flickering light beautifully. Jack raised his glass, studying Zalara over the rim. To individuality, he said, his tone light but sincere. Zalara hesitated, then raised her own glass. To those foolish enough to fight for it. They clinked glasses, the sound soft and oddly satisfying. As the meal progressed, their conversation shifted from pleasantries to deeper matters. Jack leaned forward, his voice low and serious. You never answered my question earlier. Why did your father choose me? Zalara's expression faltered, her scales shifting to a darker hue. He saw things in ways most of our people couldn't, or wouldn't. He believed the crystalline empire's obsession with perfection was hollowing us out. He wanted to change that. Jack nodded, sensing there was more. And me. Zalara's gaze dropped to the table, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass surface. You're an anomaly, Jack. A human, unmodified, unoptimized, who managed to earn respect in a galaxy that looks down on your kind. My father believed you could bridge the gap between our worlds. Jack studied her, his mind piecing together the puzzle. And what about you? Do you think he was right? Zalara's eyes met his, their depths unreadable. I'm still deciding. Before Jack could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A group of crystalline nobles entered, led by none other than Councillor Vose. His facets gleamed with an intensity that suggested he was spoiling for a confrontation. Ambassador Morrison, Vose said, his voice carrying across the room like a blade slicing through air. Princess Zalara. What a surprise to find you here, indulging in such primitive surroundings. Jack didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, taking a deliberate sip of his wine. Councillor Vose, he said smoothly, to what do we owe the pleasure? Vose's crystalline form pulsed with faint crimson undertones, an unmistakable sign of irritation. You are courting disaster, Ambassador. This so-called union threatens the stability of the Council and the crystalline empire alike. Jack set his glass down with exaggerated care, meeting Vose's gaze head-on. You mean it threatens your version of stability, the kind where individuality is crushed under the weight of conformity. Vose's facets flared, his anger no longer subtle. You dare insult the foundations of our society? Your species barely qualifies as sentient. Jack rose from his seat, his tone calm but firm. I dare to suggest that your foundations are crumbling. King Zark saw it, and so do I. The galaxy is evolving, Vose, but not in the way you think. The room was deathly silent, every patron holding their breath. Zalara stood as well, her scales shimmering with defiance. Councillor Vose, she said, her voice steady, my father's will is clear. Any attempt to undermine it is an act of treason against the Empire. Vose turned to her, his tone venomous. And you, Princess, are an embarrassment to your people. Your refusal to accept optimization has made you a pariah. Zalara's expression didn't waver, but Jack could see the pain flicker in her eyes. That's enough, Jack said sharply, stepping closer to Vose. Insult me all you want, but don't mistake her strength for weakness. Zalara represents everything your so-called perfection lacks. Courage, integrity, individuality. Vose's facets dimmed slightly, his anger giving way to calculation. You've made a grave mistake, Morrison. The Council will not stand for this. Jack smiled faintly. Let them come. I've faced worse than bureaucrats with superiority complexes.